Why did Truman fight Britain over 100,000 Jewish refugees trying to enter Palestine? It is August 1945. The war in Europe has been over for 3 months, and Earl Harrison has just given Harry Truman a report that Truman cannot put down. Not because the report is long, or because its prose is distinguished, or because its analytical framework is sophisticated, in the way that the policy documents that flow through the White House require policy sophistication to be useful. Because what the report describes is the specific human situation of the Jewish displaced persons in the camps of Germany and Austria and Italy, described in the language of a man who has visited those camps personally and who is reporting what he has seen with the directness of someone who believes that the people in Washington who are responsible for doing something about what he has seen have not yet seen it themselves. Earl Harrison is the American representative to the Intergovernmental Committee on Refugees and a former commissioner of immigration, and Truman has sent him to Europe specifically to assess the condition of the Jewish displaced persons in the American-administered camps. What Harrison finds is this: American soldiers are guarding Jewish displaced persons behind the same wire fencing that imprisoned them before the American army arrived to liberate them. The food rations in the American-administered camps are barely above the minimum that survival requires. The living conditions in some facilities are the living conditions of barracks that have not been cleaned or repaired since the camps were built for a different purpose. The medical care is insufficient for the specific medical needs of people whose physical condition the years of war and displacement have produced. Harrison writes that the Jewish displaced persons have no home to return to. The Jewish communities of Eastern Europe from which most of them came are gone in the specific sense that the communities no longer exist as functioning communities, and that the return of the displaced persons to their places of origin would be a return to the specific hostility of populations that in many cases have occupied the homes that the displaced persons left, and that are not welcoming the displaced person's return. He writes something else. He writes that the Jewish displaced person's view of their situation is consistent and specific. They want to go to Palestine, not to any other available destination, not to the United States, which has not offered them the immigration that their situation requires, and that the post-war immigration quotas whose persistence through the war's end reflects the specific inertia of the American immigration system, do not accommodate at the scale that the displaced persons' numbers require. Not to the other available destinations, whose governments have not opened their doors to the specific welcome that would make the choice of those destinations meaningful. They want to go to Palestine. Harrison writes that the most important thing the American government can do for the Jewish displaced persons is to allow 100,000 of them to enter Palestine immediately. Truman reads this. He acts on it immediately. The letter he sends to Clement Attlee on August 31st, 1945, requesting the immediate admission of 100,000 Jewish displaced persons to Palestine, is the action that initiates the fight with Britain over the refugee question that this video is built around examining, the fight whose examination requires understanding who Attlee is and what Britain's position on Palestine is, and why the British position produces the fight rather than the agreement that the American request anticipates. Attlee and Britain's position. Clement Attlee has been Prime Minister for exactly 1 month when Truman's letter arrives. His Labour government has just won the British general election that produced the most dramatic peacetime political shift in British history. The election that removes Churchill from office at the moment of the Allied victory, and that brings to power the Labour Party, whose domestic program of the welfare state and nationalization reflects the specific aspirations of the British working class, whose wartime contribution the election is their opportunity to convert into political authority. Attlee is managing a government that has inherited an imperial structure whose resources the war has exhausted, and whose political foundations the war has accelerated the erosion of, managing it in the specific context of the post-war settlement that the Labour government must navigate simultaneously with the construction of the welfare state, whose domestic program has brought them to power. Palestine is one of the inherited problems. The British position on Palestine is the position that the White Paper of 1939 has established as the operational policy of the Mandate administration, the White Paper that limits Jewish immigration to Palestine to 15,000 persons per year, and that contemplates the end of Jewish immigration entirely after 5 years without Arab consent. The White Paper has been in operation since 1939, and has been maintained throughout the war years, despite the specific pressure that the war's events have produced for its revision. Ernest Bevin is the foreign secretary in the new Labour government, and Bevin is the figure whose management of the Palestine question most directly expresses the British position in the period of the fight with Truman. Bevin's position on Palestine is the position of a man whose primary concern is the British strategic interest in the Arab world, and whose assessment of the Palestine question's impact on that strategic interest produces the specific resistance to the 100,000s admission that Truman's letter is requesting. The strategic interest in the Arab world. Britain's strategic interest in the Arab world in 1945 is the interest of an imperial power whose control of the Suez Canal and whose access to the Persian Gulf oil fields and whose military bases in Egypt and Iraq and Jordan represent the specific strategic assets that the British post-war global position depends on maintaining. The Arab states whose goodwill the maintenance of these assets requires are the Arab states that are most opposed to Jewish immigration to Palestine. The Arab states' opposition to Jewish immigration to Palestine is not ambiguous, and it is not expressed through diplomatic protest alone. It is the opposition that the Arab League, formed in March 1945, has been organizing as the collective political position of the Arab states whose territory surrounds Palestine and whose populations share the specific concern about the demographic and political transformation of Palestine that large-scale Jewish immigration represents. The Arab League has communicated to the British government that the admission of the 100,000 Jewish displaced persons to Palestine will be treated as a hostile act against Arab interests, and that the treatment will express itself in the specific forms of political opposition and military threat, whose implementation the Arab states' combined weight makes credible. Bevin believes this. He believes it not as the naive acceptance of a diplomatic threat whose credibility requires testing, but as the professional assessment of a man whose experience with the Arab world's political dynamics and whose reading of the Arab League's specific capabilities produces the conclusion that the 100,000s admission is genuinely incompatible with the maintenance of the British strategic position in the Arab world. The Bevin calculation. Bevin's calculation about the 100,000 request is the calculation of a man who is simultaneously managing the British strategic position in the Middle East and managing the domestic politics of a British Jewish community that is organized in support of the Jewish displaced persons immigration and of a wider British public whose wartime experience of the Jewish community's fate has produced a general sympathy with the displaced person's situation that the White Paper's restrictions are making politically uncomfortable to maintain. The calculation produces the specific response to Truman's letter that the subsequent fight's character reflects. Britain does not say yes to the 100,000. Britain does not say no in the direct form that a flat refusal would produce. Britain proposes a joint investigation. The Anglo-American Committee of Inquiry. Attlee's response to Truman's August 31st letter is the proposal for an Anglo-American Committee of Inquiry that will examine the Palestine question and the displaced persons situation and the relationship between them and produce the recommendations that both governments can use as the framework for the policy decisions that the examination requires. The proposal is the diplomatic management of the American pressure in the form that allows Britain to appear cooperative while deferring the specific decision that Truman's letter is requesting. Truman accepts the proposal. He accepts it not because he believes the inquiry will produce the answer faster than the direct admission of the 100,000, but because the inquiry is the available instrument of American pressure on Britain, and because the inquiry's process gives the American side the formal engagement with the Palestine question that the State Department's alternative approaches have been providing as the substitute for the direct American action that the Palestine question requires. The committee convenes in January 1946 and travels to Europe and Palestine and the Arab states in the specific sequence of visits that the investigation's scope requires and that the 12 members, 6 American and 6 British, conduct with the seriousness of people who understand that their recommendations will shape the policy that the most politically charged question of the post-war period requires. The recommendations. The Anglo-American Committee of Inquiry's report in April 1946 produces the specific recommendation that the 100,000's immediate admission to Palestine is the most pressing humanitarian requirement of the displaced person's situation, and that both governments should act on this recommendation immediately. The report also recommends that Palestine not be made exclusively either a Jewish or an Arab state, a recommendation whose specific content reflects the British position's influence on the committee's British members and whose relationship to the partition question that the subsequent United Nations process will decide, is the relationship of an intermediate recommendation that neither the Jewish Agency nor the Arab states find fully satisfactory. Truman endorses the 100,000 recommendation publicly and immediately. He endorses it before he has read the full report's other recommendations, endorses it in the specific way that his personal commitment to the displaced person's situation has been building since the Harrison report's reading, and that the 100,000 recommendations' specific correspondence to the Harrison report's specific request produces. Bevan's reaction. Bevan's reaction to Truman's immediate public endorsement of the 100,000 recommendation is the reaction of a man who is managing the Joint Committee process as the diplomatic instrument for deferring the American pressure, and who is watching Truman's public endorsement convert the committee's recommendation into the specific political pressure that the Joint Committee process was supposed to prevent the American side from applying in this form. Bevan says that Truman's endorsement of the 100,000 recommendation is motivated by the specific interest of not wanting 100,000 Jews in New York. The statement is the most diplomatically damaging thing that Bevan says in the entire fight with Truman, and it is a statement that Bevan's biographers have been examining for its specific meaning and its specific motivation since it was made. The immediate reading of the statement is anti-Semitic in the specific sense of attributing to American Jews the political motivation that Bevan identifies as the driver of Truman's position. The specific claim that Truman is supporting the 100,000's admission to Palestine because he does not want them in New York is the claim that the American Jewish community's political pressure is the driver of Truman's position, and that the position is therefore not the genuine humanitarian commitment that Truman presents it as, but the political management of a domestic constituency's demands. Truman's reaction to Bevan's statement is documented in the specific terms that Truman uses when he is furious about something that he finds both wrong and personally insulting. He is furious. The fight intensifies. The specific escalation of the Truman-Bevan fight over the 100,000 in the summer of 1946 is the escalation that the Jewish underground's military operations in Palestine are simultaneously producing, as the specific evidence that the British mandate's management of the Palestine question is failing in the practical sense of an administration that is being challenged by the organized military resistance of the Jewish community it is administering. The Irgun's bombing of the King David Hotel in Jerusalem in July 1946 is the most dramatic single expression of the Jewish underground's campaign against the British Mandate administration, killing 91 people in the explosion that destroys the wing of the hotel that houses the British administrative offices. The bombing is condemned by the Jewish Agency, whose leadership is not directing the Irgun's operations, and whose relationship to the Irgun is the relationship of the mainstream Zionist political leadership to the dissident military wing, whose tactics the mainstream rejects, while the mainstream's own military wing, the Haganah, is conducting its own operations against British targets. Britain responds to the intensification of the underground campaign with the specific instruments of military administration, the curfews and the searches and the detentions that the Mandate administration deploys against the Jewish community with the specific effect of increasing the population's resistance, rather than producing the compliance that the instruments are designed to achieve. The ships. The most visible expression of the fight between Truman and Britain over the 100,000 is the specific drama of the ships that are carrying Jewish displaced persons from the ports of Europe to the coast of Palestine, and that are being intercepted by the British Navy before they can reach the shore. The ships are chartered by the Mossad L'Aliyah Bet, the Jewish Agency's clandestine immigration organization that has been operating since before the war to facilitate the immigration of Jews to Palestine in defiance of the immigration restrictions that the British Mandate administration has been enforcing since the White Paper's publication. In the post-war period, the ship's operations are expanding in scale and frequency as the displaced persons situation in the European camps creates the specific pressure of a population that is determined to reach Palestine, and that the Mossad's organization is channeling into the specific instrument of the boats that are carrying them toward the coast. The British Navy intercepts the ships. The interception of the ships produces the images that the international press is carrying in 1946 and 1947, images of British sailors boarding the ships in the open sea, and of the passengers resisting the boarding, and of the ships being escorted to Haifa, where the passengers are transferred to the detention camps in Cyprus that Britain has established as the holding facility for the intercepted immigrants. The Cyprus camps. The Cyprus detention camps that Britain establishes in mid-1946 to hold the intercepted immigrants are the camps whose existence the Harrison Report's description of the European displaced persons camps is being extended into a new geography, the geography of British administration of people who are trying to reach Palestine being stopped and detained in a British colonial territory whose specific location in the eastern Mediterranean is the location that the British administrative convenience of the detention, rather than the welfare of the detained, is determining. Truman is receiving the reports about the Cyprus camps. He is receiving them with the same response that the Harrison Report produced in August 1945, the response of a man who reads about a specific human situation that his values cannot accommodate without doing something about it. The Cyprus camps are not the European displaced persons camps. They are not the conditions that the Harrison Report described. They are the conditions that a British detention camp for Jewish displaced persons who have attempted to reach Palestine without authorization produces as the specific expression of the British policy of enforcing the White Paper's restrictions against the people whose desperation to reach Palestine the war's events have produced. They are people who have survived years of persecution and flight and displacement who are now being held behind British wire in Cyprus, rather than being allowed to reach the destination they have been trying to reach. Truman finds this unacceptable. He says so. The fight continues. The Exodus 1947. The specific ship whose interception in July 1947 produces the most dramatic single expression of the fight between Truman and Britain over the 100,000 is the Exodus 1947, the former Chesapeake Bay passenger ferry that the Mossad has acquired and that is carrying 4,500 Jewish displaced persons from the French port of Sète toward Palestine. The Exodus 1947 is intercepted by the British Navy in the eastern Mediterranean before it reaches the Palestinian coast. The interception produces the specific drama of the British sailors boarding the ship and of the passengers resisting with the specific desperation of people who understand that the ship is their attempt to reach Palestine, and that the British interception is the specific obstacle between them and the destination they have been trying to reach for years. The resistance is physical. The British response to the physical resistance is physical. The fighting on the deck of the Exodus 1947 during the interception produces casualties. 2 passengers and a crew member are killed. The ship is escorted to Haifa. At Haifa, Britain makes the decision whose specific nature and whose specific consequences for the fight with Truman are the most consequential British error of the entire Palestine period. Britain decides not to send the Exodus 1947's passengers to Cyprus. It decides to send them back to Europe, not to France, which has offered to accept the passengers on a voluntary basis, to the British-occupied zone of Germany. Jewish displaced persons who have survived years of persecution and displacement in Europe and who have attempted to reach Palestine are being sent back to Germany by the British government. The specific brutality of this decision, the decision to return Jewish displaced persons to the country from whose persecution they fled, in the specific form of the British military forcing the passengers off the Exodus 1947 ships in Hamburg when the passengers resist the disembarkation, is the brutality that the international press covers with the specific intensity that the story's moral clarity produces. The images from Hamburg are the images of British soldiers using physical force to remove Jewish displaced persons from ships in a German port. The images reach the United States. They reach the American public. They reach Truman. Truman's reaction to the Exodus 1947's handling is the reaction of a man whose fight with Britain over the 100,000 has been building since August 1945, and whose reading of the Exodus 1947's handling's specific brutality through the press coverage that the American public is receiving produces the specific crystallization of the fight's moral dimension that the Exodus 1947 represents. He is appalled. The reaction is not primarily strategic. It is not the calculation of a man who is managing the American-British relationship with the specific attention to the relationship's strategic dimensions that the State Department's framework for the relationship produces. It is the direct personal response of a man whose values have been formed by the specific Protestant moral tradition of independence, Missouri, and whose reading of what is happening to Jewish displaced persons in European ports, because Britain is enforcing a policy that Truman believes is wrong, is the reading that the human being rather than the strategic manager produces. He continues fighting. The UNSCOP, the United Nations Special Committee on Palestine that begins its work in May 1947, established after Britain announces that it is referring the Palestine question to the United Nations, because the mandate has become unmanageable in the specific form that the Jewish Underground's campaign and the American pressure and the Arab opposition are together producing, is the international instrument through which the fight between Truman and Britain over the Palestine question moves from the bilateral Anglo-American argument about the 100,000 to the multilateral United Nations process about the partition question that will produce the November 1947 vote. Britain's referral of the Palestine question to the United Nations is not the capitulation to Truman's position that the referral's sequence in the story might suggest. It is the specific management of an impossible situation by a government that has concluded that the bilateral management of the Palestine question is producing the specific combination of Arab hostility and Jewish underground violence and American diplomatic pressure and international press attention that is making the mandate's continuation politically unsustainable in the British domestic political environment. The mandate is costing Britain too much, not in the specific strategic currency of the Arab world, relationships that Bevan's calculation has identified as the primary cost of admitting the 100,000. In the specific human and political currency of the soldiers who are being killed by the Jewish underground and the sailors who are intercepting ships in the Mediterranean and the administrators who are managing the Cyprus camps, and the international reputation that the handling of the Exodus 1947 is producing in the American press and the United Nations corridors. Britain wants out. The United Nations reference is the instrument of getting out. Truman's position through the UNSCOP process. Truman's position through the UNSCOP process and through the United Nations General Assembly's deliberations on the UNSCOP report is the position that produces the American vote for the partition resolution on November 29, 1947. The vote that the fight between Truman and Britain over the 100,000 has been building toward since August 1945. The American vote for partition is not a foregone conclusion. The State Department is arguing against it. The Defense Department is arguing against it. The CIA is arguing against it. The American oil companies whose interests in the Arab world are providing the specific economic argument for the Arab states' position are arguing against it. The arguments are real, and they are based on genuine assessments of the strategic consequences that the partition resolution's passage will produce in the Arab world and in the American-Arab relationship. Truman overrides them. He overrides them not because he has a strategic argument that defeats each of the State Department's specific objections, but because his personal reading of the Palestine question's moral dimension, the reading that the Harrison Report produced in August 1945, and that the Exodus 1947's handling confirmed in July 1947, and that the specific continuity of the fight with Britain over the 100,000 has been reinforcing for 2 years, is the reading that produces the presidential decision in the form of the instruction to the American delegation to vote yes. The instruction is given over the State Department's objections. The American delegation votes yes. The partition resolution passes. Why Truman fought Britain. The why of the fight between Truman and Britain over the 100,000 is the question that the full record requires answering honestly, rather than in the single-factor explanation that either the American domestic politics narrative or the moral conviction narrative provides alone. Truman fights Britain over the 100,000 because of what the Harrison Report says about the specific human situation of the Jewish displaced persons in the European camps, and because the reading of a specific human situation that his values cannot accommodate without doing something about it is the response that Truman's character produces consistently throughout his presidency. Truman fights Britain over the 100,000 because the American Jewish community's political organization is producing the specific domestic political pressure that a Democratic president managing the 1946 midterm elections and the 1948 presidential campaign cannot entirely ignore, and whose management requires the active engagement with the Palestine question that the fight with Britain represents. Truman fights Britain over the 100,000 Because the specific British position, the White Paper's restrictions enforced by the British Navy's interception of ships carrying displaced persons and the Cyprus camps, and the Exodus 1947's handling in Hamburg, is the position that the American press and the American public is reading as the specific expression of the British imperial management of a humanitarian emergency in a way that the American democratic tradition finds incompatible. Truman fights Britain over the 100,000 because the fight is right. These are not separable explanations. They are the components of the same decision made by the same man in the same moment. The man whose values the Harrison Report has activated. The politician whose constituency the American Jewish community's political organization represents. The American whose press is showing him the Exodus 1947 images. The president whose instruction to the American delegation produces the yes vote on November 29, 1947. All of these are Harry Truman. The fight with Britain is the expression of all of them. The ships got through, not immediately and not all of them. The partition resolution passes, and the state is declared, and the Arab armies invade, and the war is fought, and the state survives, and the displaced persons arrive. The 100,000 that the Harrison Report requested, and that Truman's letter to Attlee demanded in August 1945, arrive in the years after the state's creation, in the specific form of the immigration that the new state's law of return provides for every Jewish person who wants to come. They come. The fight that Truman fought with Britain is the fight that made the coming possible. It is not the only thing that made it possible. But without the fight, the arriving would have happened differently and on a different timeline, and in a world where the British mandates management of the Palestine question, rather than the United Nations Partition Resolution's framework for the Jewish state's creation, would have determined the conditions under which the displaced person's situation was resolved. Truman fought Britain. The fight mattered. The 100,000 came.